According to every document we had, zoning maps, tax registries, utility and infrastructure records, the structure had been formally closed and decommissioned decades ago. Now, a phantom address isn't unheard of. Old data has a way of sticking around in systems long after it's obsolete. So, a lingering code alone wouldn't have been enough to get my attention. But this was more than just old data. The same location code was appearing in active patrol logs, multiple times, stretching back several years. Each entry was completely routine, just a timestamp, a badge number, and a short, automated confirmation of presence. No detailed remarks, no incident reports. Just officers checking in, confirming their location, and moving on. It was the kind of thing you'd see 1,000 times a day. But when I started cross-referencing these logs, a disturbing pattern emerged. These weren't typos or clerical errors from one person. The entries came from dozens of different officers, from different units, on different shifts. Many of these officers had never even worked together. It was clear the system treated this address as a real, active patrol point. And so did the officers. But the city, on paper, insisted it wasn't there. My next step was to pull the original case file for the location. I wanted to see the history, why it was closed, when it was demolished, who owned the land. What I got back was a folder that was disturbingly thin. There was no formal closure report, no record of a demolition crew ever being dispatched, no transfer of ownership. It was as if the building had just been administratively erased, phased out of official documents without ever being physically torn down. A gradual, silent disappearance from the city's memory. At this point, I was still leaning towards a massive bureaucratic screw-up. It was strange, for sure, but probably explainable. Maybe the demolition records were lost. Maybe the paperwork was misfiled decades ago. It happens. But then I found the detail that turned this from a records-keeping problem into something else entirely. I decided to start talking to the officers whose names were in the logs. And what they told me, that's when the chills started to set in. Some of them, not all, but a significant number, had absolutely no memory of being there. When I showed them the logs, they'd recognize their own badge number. They'd confirm the handwriting in the old paper logs was theirs, or that the digital signature on the newer ones was authentic. They knew they had made the entry, but when I asked them to describe the location, they drew a complete blank. No mental image of the street, the building, the doorway. Nothing. Just a vague, indistinct feeling that it must have been a completely unremarkable, routine stop. It was like a specific memory had been surgically removed, leaving behind only the knowledge that something had happened. This was the turning point. It was one thing for the city's records to be a mess. It was another thing entirely for veteran officers to have identical, specific gaps in their memory about the same non-existent place. That's when I knew I couldn't just sit behind my desk anymore. I had to see this place for myself. I pulled up the address on a digital map. It pointed to a small, forgotten industrial block on the edge of the city, wedged between a derelict warehouse and an old railway line that hadn't seen a train in 50 years. It was the kind of place you'd drive by 1,000 times and never notice. The satellite view was grainy, but it showed exactly what the record said shouldn't be there. A building. A low-slung, brick structure, its roof stained with age. It looked real enough from orbit. The next morning, I drove out there. The neighborhood felt heavy, quiet. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and rust. And there it was, just like the satellite image, tucked away behind a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire that had long since rusted through. The building stood in defiance of every official document that claimed its non-existence. It was a 2-story brick building, with no signs, no numbers, just boarded-up windows and a heavy steel door padlocked from the outside. The padlock was ancient, covered in layers of grime and rust. It clearly hadn't been opened in a very, very long time. I walked the perimeter. The fence was weak in several places, easy enough to get through. The ground was littered with debris, but there were no fresh tracks, no signs of recent activity. It felt completely abandoned. Yet, according to our logs, an officer had been here less than 48 hours ago. How? How did they log their presence without getting out of their car? The gate was locked. There was no other way in. I called dispatch and asked them to run the GPS coordinates for the last patrol car that logged a visit. The result came back instantly. The coordinates matched my exact location. The system was certain the officer had been right here. I went back to the steel door and examined the padlock again. It was a heavy-duty model, the kind you'd see on a shipping container. There was no way to open it without a key or a pair of bolt cutters, and there were no signs of it being forced. Standing there, I felt a strange sense of unreality. The building was real. I could touch its cold, damp bricks, but it was also impossible. It was officially gone, yet here it stood. Officers had been visiting it for years, yet the gate was rusted shut, and those same officers couldn't remember it. It was a contradiction made of brick and mortar. I spent the next few weeks digging deeper. I went through old, archived city council minutes from the 70s, hoping to find any mention of the property. I found one, just one, brief entry. It was a motion to approve the expedited administrative closure of the site due to structural and environmental concerns. There was no debate, no further details. It was approved unanimously and never mentioned again. Expedited administrative closure. I'd never heard that term before or since. It sounded like a fancy way of saying, make it disappear from the books. The real breakthrough, if you can call it that, came from a retired officer I tracked down. His name had appeared in the logs more than anyone else's back in the early 90s. When I first called him, he gave me the same story. He recognized his handwriting, but had no memory of the place. But a few days later, he called me back. He said our conversation had bothered him, that it had dredged something up. He told me he had a dream. In the dream, he was parked in his patrol car, right where I had been standing. He wasn't getting out, he was just looking at the building. In his dream, one of the boarded-up windows on the second floor wasn't boarded up. There was a light on, a dim, flickering yellow light. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him even after waking up, that he was supposed to be there. Not to go inside, but just to be there, to watch. He said he felt like he was standing guard. He couldn't explain it any better than that. He just knew his job was to be present, to log his time, and to leave. It was a silent, unspoken duty. This was never a police matter. It was something else. A procedure that existed outside the normal chain of command. A ritual passed down through phantom memories. That's where the trail goes cold. The case was eventually closed, filed away under unresolved administrative discrepancy. But for me, it was never resolved. What was that building? What were those officers guarding? And why the elaborate system of collective institutional amnesia to keep it running? The building is still there. I checked on a satellite map just last week. It's still standing, still silent. Sometimes I wonder if patrol cars still stop there in the dead of night. Their occupants logging their presence before driving away. The memory of their strange, quiet duty already starting to fade. It's a place that exists and doesn't. A case that's closed but not solved. And that's why it still comes up in my thoughts. Thanks for listening to my story. If you find mysteries like this as fascinating as I do, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. Stay curious. When I went to the location myself, I didn't go in uniform. I was already close to retirement back then. Plain clothes had become my default. I remember exactly how I looked that day, not because it was special, but because the reflection of myself stayed with me afterward, etched in my memory. My hair was grey, already thinning at the temples, a stark reminder of the years gone by. My face was lined, etched with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could ever erase. It wasn't the kind of tiredness from a long shift. It was deeper, a weariness that settles into your bones after decades of repetition, of seeing the same patterns play out over and over again. I wore a worn jacket, nothing official about it, something comfortable that wouldn't draw any attention. I had a bundle of paperwork tucked under one arm. No weapon was visible. I didn't look like an active duty officer anymore. Honestly, I probably looked more like an accountant who stayed too late at his desk, sorting through numbers instead of human dramas. The building was exactly where the map said it would be. No surprises there. It was wedged between two other structures that clearly belonged, that had a purpose. But this one, It felt out of place. From the outside, it offered nothing, no sign, no number on the door. Just a blank facade of concrete, slightly discolored with age and weather. It was an anonymous face in a crowd of buildings that all had names. The door wasn't locked, which was the first odd detail. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air felt neutral. That's the only word for it. Not stale, like a place that's been sealed for years, but not fresh either. It was just unused. The lighting was purely functional but subdued, casting these long, soft shadows down corridors that seemed to stretch on, feeling longer than they should have been. I remember thinking how unnaturally quiet it was. It wasn't the silence of an abandoned place, thick with dust and decay. It was an administrative quiet. The kind you find in government offices after everyone has gone home for the day, a silence that's waiting for the next business day to start. There was no furniture, not a single chair, not a desk, not a filing cabinet. No personal objects left behind. No coffee mugs, no stray pens, nothing to indicate people had ever worked here. There was absolutely no indication of its purpose. It was a shell. I walked slowly, not out of any particular caution, but just out of habit. Years on the force teach you to observe, to take things in, to move deliberately. At some point, I just stopped in the middle of a long hallway and became intensely aware of my own presence in that empty space. An older man, standing completely alone, surrounded by a building that had no clear reason to exist. It was a profoundly strange feeling, a sense of being an intruder in a place that had no occupants to disturb. I glanced at my watch. Less than 20 minutes had passed since I'd arrived. It felt longer. When I left, I did what I had done thousands of times before. I locked the door behind me, went back to my car and logged the visit. Time, date, location, initial observation, premises empty, purpose unknown. Standard procedure. Later that week, I was back at my desk, under the familiar dim glow of my lamp, which illuminated stacks of old, forgotten files. On a whim, I decided to pull up the system log and search for my own entry. It wasn't there. The system showed activity at that address before my visit, and it showed activity after, but my visit, my log, my presence, it was a complete blank, as if I had never been there at all. I just stared at the screen for a lot longer than I should have. The reflection looking back at me from the dark monitor was tired, confused, and somehow he looked even older than I remembered being just a few days before. From that moment on, I handled the case differently. I couldn't just file it away as unfounded. Something was wrong. I started to approach it more carefully, more quietly. I didn't want to raise any flags or attract unwanted attention. I began requesting older maps of the city, archived blueprints, physical records from city planning that hadn't been digitized yet. I spent hours in dusty archives, poring over brittle paper, but the information never aligned. It was a puzzle with pieces from different boxes. Some official documents, usually older ones, showed the structure clearly, marked and plotted. But others, sometimes from the very same era, replaced it with an empty lot, a patch of green, or just blank space. There was no official beginning for this building, no record of its construction permit, no deed of sale. And there was no official end, no demolition order. It was a ghost on paper, appearing and disappearing across decades of official records. Eventually, my supervisor got wind of what I was doing. He called me into his office, told me I was spending too much time on a non-issue. He advised me, firmly, to close the inquiry. There was no violation, he said, no reported incident, nothing actionable. It was a dead end. So, with retirement just around the corner, I did as I was told. I closed the file. But closing a file doesn't close your mind. Now, years later, I sit at a desk much like the one I had back then. The papers are different, mostly books and personal research now, but they're still neatly stacked. The light is still focused on documents that probably no one else ever reads. I'm no longer an officer. I'm just a man with a memory that never fully organized itself into an explanation. A loose thread that I can't help but pull at from time to time in my thoughts. That address, that non-existent building, It still appears sometimes. I'll see it mentioned in a passing news article about zoning changes, or spot the lot on an updated satellite map online. It's there, then it's not. Briefly, without consequence. And I've come to accept that some things don't remain in your memory because they were important, or because they mattered in the grand scheme of things. They remain simply because they were never resolved. They are the questions without answers, the quiet moments in empty hallways that you carry with you forever. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy stories about the strange and unexplained, be sure to subscribe for more.